When Arthur and Beatrice spent their last $6 on a rusted, abandoned county jail, their estranged children laughed from afar. The elderly couple was penniless, freezing, and cast aside. But beneath the decaying iron bars lay a century-old secret that would not only change their lives forever, but make those who abandoned them desperately beg for forgiveness. Arthur Pendleton stared at the flashing red battery icon on his prehistoric flip phone, hoping against hope that the screen would light up with a call from his son. It did not. Beside him, on the damp mattress of a dilapidated roadside motel, his wife, Beatrice, quietly packed their remaining clothes into faded canvas bags. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the agonizing realization that the people they loved most in this world had entirely erased them from their lives. For 40 years, Arthur and Beatrice had lived a quiet, respectable life in the suburbs of Portland. Arthur had worked tirelessly as a heavy machinery mechanic, while Beatrice managed a local bakery. They had saved diligently, building a comfortable nest egg for their twilight years. But their greatest weakness had always been their children, David and Sarah. 2 years ago, David, a smooth-talking but perpetually struggling entrepreneur, had come to them in tears. His logistics startup was on the verge of collapse, and he needed a massive injection of cash to save it. Against the advice of their financial planner, Arthur and Beatrice took out a second mortgage, handing over $300,000 to their son. Less than 6 months later, their daughter Sarah arrived at their doorstep, embroiled in a bitter, high-stakes divorce. She needed top-tier lawyers to secure custody of her children and keep her lifestyle afloat. Arthur and Beatrice, unable to bear the thought of their daughter's suffering, liquidated their retirement accounts and drained their life savings to pay her legal fees. They had given everything, and when the well finally ran dry, the unthinkable happened. The bank foreclosed on the Pendleton family, home of 4 decades. When Arthur called David to ask for a temporary place to stay, his son claimed his new condo didn't allow extended guests and abruptly ended the call. When Beatrice texted Sarah, begging for just a few weeks in her guest room until they could figure things out, the message was left on read. Soon after, both children changed their phone numbers. The abandonment was total, brutal, and swift. Now, at 72 and 69 years old, Arthur and Beatrice were functionally homeless. They had exactly $11 to their name, and their motel checkout time was rapidly approaching. The biting chill of November was already creeping through the poorly insulated window, a grim reminder that winter would not spare them. "We have to go, Artie," Beatrice said softly, zipping up her canvas bag. Her voice held no anger, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. "The manager is already pacing outside." Arthur nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He helped his wife to her feet, his arthritic knees popping in protest. They walked out of the motel room and into the freezing rain, carrying their entire lives in 4 bags. With nowhere else to go, they wandered toward the town square, seeking shelter from the downpour in the lobby of the municipal courthouse. It was there, shivering in the corner, that Arthur noticed a crowd gathering in the main hall. A banner hung above the oak double doors, Black Ridge County Delinquent Tax Property Auction. Desperation does strange things to a man's mind. Arthur walked over to the bulletin board, scanning the list of foreclosed properties being auctioned off by the county. Most were large plots of land or abandoned farmhouses with starting bids in the thousands. But at the very bottom of the list, a peculiar listing caught his eye. Parcel 402, decommissioned county holding facility, 0.1 acres. Structure condemned. Starting bid, $5. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. $5. He reached into his pocket and felt the crumpled $5 bill and the single $1 bill beside it. "Ladies and gentlemen, we move on to parcel 402, announced Thomas Gable, the county auctioneer, his voice echoing through the hall. The old rusted jailhouse out on Miller's Ridge. Let's be honest, folks, it's an eyesore and a liability. The county just wants it off the books so we don't have to pay for the demolition. Do I have a starting bid of $5? The room erupted in quiet chuckles. The local real estate developers scoffed. No one wanted a 100-year-old rusted iron box sitting on a useless sliver of rocky land. $5? Anyone? Thomas Gable asked, sighing and preparing to strike his gavel to mark the property unsold. $6. Arthur's voice cracked as he spoke, echoing through the silent hall. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. People looked at the disheveled elderly man in his damp coat, holding up a shaking hand. "I have $6, Thomas Gable stammered, clearly bewildered. "Going once. Going twice. Sold. To the gentleman in the back. For $6. Arthur walked to the clerk's desk, ignoring the mocking stares and suppressed laughter from the well-dressed investors around him. He smoothed out his crumpled bills and slid them across the counter. He signed the paperwork with a trembling hand. He and Beatrice now owned a home. It was a condemned, rusted jail, but it belonged to them. When word reached David and Sarah through a mutual family acquaintance a few days later, they didn't reach out to offer help. Instead, David was overheard at a country club dinner, laughing about it, telling his friends that his parents had finally lost their marbles and bought a literal cage. Sarah simply blocked the acquaintance's number for bringing up her parents. They washed their hands of the situation completely, convinced that the harsh winter would eventually force the county to institutionalize the old couple, thereby keeping their own hands clean of the mess. They had no idea what Arthur and Beatrice were about to uncover. The walk to Miller's Ridge took Arthur and Beatrice 3 agonizing hours. The property sat a mile outside the town limits, hidden behind a dense, overgrown thicket of dying pine trees. When they finally broke through the brush, the reality of their purchase hit them like a physical blow. The Black Ridge County holding facility was a nightmare of decay. Built in 1892 to house local criminals and unruly minors before transport to the state penitentiary, it consisted of heavy, riveted iron walls and 3 barred cells set upon a thick concrete foundation. The wooden roof had partially caved in decades ago, leaving the rusted iron beams exposed to the sky like the ribs of a rotting carcass. Weeds grew through the cracks in the foundation, and the heavy steel door hung off a single, screaming hinge. It was horrifying, but as Arthur looked at Beatrice, expecting her to finally break down and cry, he saw something else entirely. She walked forward, picked up a discarded, rusted pipe, and wedged it under the fallen front door, levering it open with a sharp grunt. "Well," Beatrice said, wiping rain from her forehead, "it has good bones, and it's ours." Over the next 2 weeks, the elderly couple embarked on a brutal, back-breaking campaign of survival. They scavenged discarded industrial tarps from a nearby construction site dumpster to create a makeshift roof over the 2 cells that remained structurally sound. They gathered deadwood from the surrounding forest, building a fire pit in the center of the old guard's processing area where the roof had opened a natural chimney. They survived on cheap canned beans and rice, purchased with the few coins they scavenged from the highway median. Their hands blistered and bled. Arthur's back ached so deeply he could barely stand in the mornings, and Beatrice's cough grew worse with the damp chill. Yet, they worked with a manic, undeniable determination. Every piece of rusted debris they dragged out of the jail was a metaphorical piece of their past they were throwing away. They were purging the grief of their children's betrayal through pure physical labor. But their meager progress was interrupted on the 15th day. A sleek white county vehicle pulled up to the edge of the property. Out stepped Leonard Walsh, the county building inspector, a man known for his rigid adherence to the rules and a profound lack of empathy. He picked his way through the mud, a clipboard pressed against his chest, looking at the patched-up iron jail with utter disgust. "Arthur Pendleton?" Walsh barked, not bothering to offer a greeting. Arthur stepped out of the rusted doorway, wiping soot from his hands. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" "You can't live here, Pendleton. This structure was condemned 30 years ago," Walsh said, thrusting a yellow sheet of paper toward the old man. "I'm issuing a formal citation. You have 14 days to bring this property up to residential code, or the county will bulldoze it with you inside. And let me save you the math. Getting this rusted tin can up to code will cost you at least $40,000. Arthur's heart plummeted into his stomach. 14 days? "Mr. Walsh, please, winter is setting in. We have nowhere else to go. We're just trying to patch the roof." "Not my problem," Walsh sneered, turning on his heel. 14 days. I'll be back with a demolition crew." That night, the temperature dropped below freezing. Arthur and Beatrice huddled together beneath a pile of scavenged blankets, the wind howling through the iron bars of their makeshift home. The yellow citation paper sat near the fire, a death sentence for their last shred of independence. "We have to reinforce the Western Foundation," Arthur whispered into the darkness, his mind racing for a solution, refusing to surrender. "If I can dig out the rotted concrete under the solitary confinement cell and pack it with the fieldstone from the yard, it might stabilize the wall enough to pass the structural inspection." "You can't dig concrete, Artie. You don't have the tools," Beatrice murmured, her voice weak. "I have to try. I won't let them take this from us. I won't let David and Sarah be right." At dawn, Arthur took the rusted iron pipe Beatrice had used on their first day and began chipping away at the crumbling, century-old concrete floor inside the smallest, darkest cell, the solitary confinement block. The work was agonizing. Hours passed. His hands were raw, slick with his own blood, but he kept slamming the heavy pipe downward, breaking the concrete into chunks and tossing them aside. He was 2 feet deep into the foundation, his chest heaving with exhaustion, when the pipe struck something that sent a massive, violent vibration up his arms. Clang. It wasn't the dull thud of earth or the hard crack of rock. It was a hollow, resonant metallic sound. Arthur froze. He fell to his knees, using his bare, bleeding hands to frantically scoop away the dirt and crushed concrete. He dug until his fingernails cracked. Buried deep within the foundation, intentionally hidden beneath the solitary confinement cell, was a massive, heavy iron box. It was padlocked and covered in a thick layer of oxidized crust, but as Arthur wiped the dirt away, he could see faint, faded lettering stamped into the top. "Property of the First National Bank of Blackridge. Transport, 1,928. Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. He called out for Beatrice, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form her name. As she rushed into the cell and fell to her knees beside him, staring into the dark hole in the foundation, the rusted jail suddenly felt very, very different. For a long moment, the only sound inside the freezing, dilapidated solitary confinement cell was the heavy, ragged breathing of the elderly couple. Arthur stared at the rusted 1,928 iron bank box, his bleeding hands hovering over the heavy brass padlock that sealed it shut. "Artie," Beatrice whispered, the cold forgotten, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "What is it?" "I don't know," Arthur replied, his voice raspy. But it didn't end up under a foot of concrete by accident. He grabbed the heavy iron pipe once more. Exhaustion had settled deep into his bones, but pure adrenaline fueled his next. On the 4th strike, the century-old metal casing splintered. With a sickening crunch, the lock gave way. Arthur pulled the heavy hasp free and, with Beatrice's help, lifted the groaning iron lid. The smell of dry rot, oiled canvas, and stale, trapped air wafted up from the dark interior. Inside, tightly packed and wrapped in layers of heavy, wax-coated canvas, were several heavy bundles. Arthur carefully lifted the first bundle out. It was surprisingly heavy, the size of a brick. With trembling fingers, he peeled back the brittle wax paper. A dull, rich yellow gleam reflected the weak morning light filtering through the rusted bars. Beatrice gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. Neatly stacked within the canvas were dozens of pristine, uncirculated gold coins. Arthur, who had been an avid coin collector in his youth before selling his modest collection to pay for David's first college tuition, recognized the iconic design instantly. They were St. Gaudens double eagles, but it was the mint mark and the date that made the blood drain from his face. 1927D. "Dear God in heaven," Arthur choked out, holding one of the heavy gold coins up to the light. "B. These are 1,927 Denver Mint double eagles. They are some of the rarest gold coins in American history. Almost the entire mintage was melted down by the government in the 1930s. Only a handful are known to exist. There were at least 40 of them in the first bundle alone, and there were 5 more bundles in the box. But the coins were not the only secret the box held. Beneath the gold lay a thick, leather-bound ledger and a sealed manila envelope bearing the official wax seal of the First National Bank of Blackridge. Arthur broke the seal and slid the fragile documents out. As he read the elegant, cursive handwriting, the true scope of their discovery and the reason for their current misery came sharply into focus. The documents were the original, unaltered 1,928 mineral rights and land deeds for Miller's Ridge. The ledger detailed a secret geological survey commissioned by a corrupt bank manager 90 years ago, proving that the exact plot of land the jail sat upon was situated directly over one of the richest, untapped subterranean lithium and rare earth mineral veins in the state. The bank manager had hidden the gold and the deeds just before he was arrested for embezzlement, intending to claim the land later. He died in prison, and the secret remained buried. Suddenly, the cruelty of Leonard Walsh, the county building inspector, made perfect, horrifying sense. "They knew," Arthur said, his voice hardening into steel. "The county didn't want to bulldoze this place because it was an eyesore. They wanted it condemned so a local developer could snatch it up for pennies and mine the lithium. That's why Walsh gave us an impossible 14-day deadline. They were trying to scare us off the land." Beatrice's posture changed. The weary, broken woman who had been kicked out into the freezing rain vanished. In her place stood a fierce, resilient matriarch who had finally been pushed too far. "They picked the wrong couple to bully," Beatrice said quietly. "What do we do, Artie?" "We make a phone call." Using the last sliver of battery on his flip phone, Arthur didn't call the police. He called Jonathan Sterling, a senior appraiser and regional director for a high-end auction house in Seattle, a man Arthur had read about in a numismatic magazine years ago. When Arthur described the 1927, D coins, and the bank seal, Sterling initially thought it was a prank. But Arthur's desperate, detailed description of the mint marks convinced him. Less than 12 hours later, a black armored SUV pulled up to the rusted jail under the cover of darkness. Jonathan Sterling stepped out, flanked by 2 private security contractors. When Sterling entered the cell and examined the coins under a jeweler's loupe, his hands shook violently. "Mr. Pendleton," Sterling breathed, looking up with wide eyes, "you haven't just found a treasure. You've rewritten American numismatic history. At auction, a single 1927D in this condition could fetch upwards of $2 million. You have nearly 200 of them." Arthur didn't blink. "I don't need an auction right now, Mr. Sterling. I need liquidity. Tonight. And I need the best real estate and defense attorney in the state." Sterling agreed to broker an immediate private sale of 3 coins to a billionaire collector in Geneva for a heavily discounted rate of $4 million cash, advancing the Pendletons $2 million by wire transfer the very next morning. On day 13 of their 14-day deadline, Leonard Walsh arrived at the jail with a yellow bulldozer idling behind his county truck. He stepped out, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face, ready to evict the homeless couple. Instead, he was met by Margaret Kensington, a ruthless, top-tier corporate lawyer from Seattle, wearing a pristine white trench coat. Behind her stood a private construction crew, heavily armed private security, and Arthur and Beatrice sipping hot coffee from expensive thermoses. "Mr. Walsh," Margaret said, handing the stunned inspector a thick stack of legal injunctions. "This property is now a protected historical site, fully funded for private restoration, and completely up to residential code per the emergency structural reinforcements completed yesterday. Furthermore, we have filed a federal lawsuit against you and Blackridge County for racketeering, corruption, and attempted illegal seizure of mineral rights." Walsh looked at the bulldozer, then at the security guards, his face turning the color of ash. He turned and fled without speaking a single word. 6 months later, Miller's Ridge was unrecognizable. Arthur and Beatrice didn't tear down the rusted jail. They transformed it. Using millions from the ongoing, careful sale of their gold, they hired visionary architects to integrate the historic iron structure into a breathtaking, sprawling, modern mansion. The original riveted iron bars were polished and encased in thick, bulletproof glass, serving as the dramatic centerpiece of a massive, sunlit living room with heated Italian marble floors. The old guard's quarters became a state-of-the-art chef's kitchen for Beatrice, complete with copper fixtures and 2 massive ovens. They were safe, they were warm, and they were unimaginably wealthy. They also quietly transferred the lithium mineral rights into a blind trust, ensuring the land would never be strip mined preserving the surrounding forest as a private wildlife sanctuary. Inevitably, the secret got out. A prominent national news outlet caught wind of the story and ran a massive Sunday feature. Abandoned by society, elderly couple finds $150, million gold cash and $6 condemned jail. The article featured a stunning photograph of Arthur and Beatrice standing proudly in front of their modern, iron and glass fortress. 300 miles away, in a cramped, rented apartment, David Pendleton dropped his tablet onto the table, his jaw unhinged. His logistics startup had completely collapsed 2 months prior, burying him in a mountain of insurmountable debt. He was facing bankruptcy and a potential fraud investigation. Across town, Sarah stared at the same article on her phone. Her bitter divorce had left her with a fraction of the settlement she expected, and her extravagant lifestyle had completely drained her credit cards. She was facing eviction from her luxury townhouse. The realization hit them both with the force of a freight train. The parents they had ruthlessly discarded, the parents they had left to freeze in the mud, were now centimillionaires. The panic and greed were instantaneous. The very next afternoon, a leased silver Mercedes sedans sped up the freshly paved, winding driveway of Miller's Ridge, stopping at the imposing wrought-iron security gates. David and Sarah stood at the intercom, buzzing frantically. "Mom! Dad! It's us!" David yelled into the speaker, practicing his most distressed, apologetic face. "Please, let us in! We've been so worried about you." The heavy gates hummed and slowly swung open. David and Sarah rushed their car up to the main courtyard, their eyes widening at the sheer opulence of the estate. They practically sprinted to the massive glass front doors. Arthur and Beatrice stepped out onto the front portico. They were dressed impeccably, looking healthier, younger, and stronger than they had in years. But their faces were unreadable. There was no warmth. There was no anger. There was only a cold, impenetrable calm. "Mom, Dad, oh my God," Sarah sobbed, forcing tears to stream down her cheeks as she ran forward with her arms open. "We've been looking everywhere for you. When we lost contact, I was sick with worry." "You look incredible!" Beatrice held up a single hand, stopping her daughter dead in her tracks. "Save your breath, Sarah." "Dad, listen." David stepped forward, putting on his best, most earnest salesman voice. "I know things got messed up. I had a mental breakdown with the business. I wasn't in my right mind when we last spoke, but I'm here now. We can fix this. We're a family. You shouldn't be managing an estate like this alone at your age. I can help you invest the capital, protect the assets." "Invest it like your startup, David?" Arthur asked, his voice slicing through the crisp mountain air like a razor. David swallowed hard, his fake smile faltering. "Dad, that's not fair." "Fair?" Arthur stepped off the portico, looking his son dead in the eye. "Fair was you taking our life savings to play businessman? Fair was us sleeping on a damp motel mattress because we paid your sister's legal bills so she could keep her country club membership. We called you, David. We begged you for a couch to sleep on. You hung up on us." "I didn't know how bad it was," David lied, his voice trembling. "You laughed at us," Beatrice said quietly from the porch. "We know about the joke you made at the country club dinner, about us buying a cage." Sarah shot a panicked glare at her brother. "Mom, that was just a stupid rumor. We love you. You're our parents. You can't just cut us out of your lives." "You cut yourselves out, Sarah," Beatrice replied, her voice steady and devoid of the motherly weakness they were hoping to exploit. "When we had nothing, we were an embarrassment, a burden. Now that we have a fortune, we are suddenly your beloved family again. Do you really think we are that foolish?" Arthur reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a small, framed piece of paper and handed it to David. David looked down. It was the original, crumpled county auction receipt for $6. "This is all you are ever going to get from us," Arthur said, his tone absolute. "We have established a trust. Every cent of the gold, every acre of this land, will go to local charities, veterans shelters, and the county orphanage when we pass. You two are entirely disinherited." "You can't do that," Sarah shrieked, dropping the sweet daughter act entirely, her face twisting in ugly, desperate rage. "We are your blood. That money belongs to us. I'm drowning in debt." "I need help." "Then you should have learned to build a roof out of tarps," Arthur said simply. He turned around and walked up the steps, taking Beatrice's hand. "Leave," Arthur said over his shoulder. "If you are still on this property in 3 minutes, the security detail will have you arrested for trespassing." They walked through the heavy glass doors, the electronic locks engaging with a definitive heavy click. David and Sarah stood alone in the courtyard, the cold wind whipping around them. They pounded on the glass. They screamed. They begged. But the soundproof walls of the restored jail absorbed their cries. Arthur and Beatrice sat on their plush velvet sofa inside, drinking tea, refusing to even look back. The children had gambled with their parents' lives, assuming they held all the cards. Now, bankrupt and broken, they finally realized they had discarded the only true treasure they ever had. Arthur and Beatrice's incredible journey from a freezing $6 rusted cage to a multi-million-dollar modern fortress proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden beneath the hardest struggles and the deepest betrayals. Did the children deserve their brutal final rejection, or should the parents have forgiven them? Let us know your thoughts in the